We quietly abandoned the cooking tricks that once turned simple meals into something unforgettable. Passed down hands, not apps. But what vanished from our kitchens when we stopped learning this way? Stick around. What you're about to see was never meant to be lost. Now here is a little trick pulled straight from the coffee-stained counters of your favorite old roadside diner. If you ever had a cup of coffee in the 1950s that felt surprisingly smooth, odds are it had nothing to do with the beans. It was the salt. Just a pinch of regular old table salt tossed in with the coffee grounds before brewing made all the difference. It did not just tame the bitterness, it actually brought out the natural richness of the roast. Diner cooks swore by it, and for good reason. When coffee quality could be hit or miss and creamers were more wishful thinking than reality, salt made your morning cup taste like something worth waking up for. It was cheap, easy, and nobody talked about it out loud. It was one of those you had to be there kinds of kitchen secrets. Funny how the best tricks never made it to the back of the packaging. But for all the coffee fixes folks came up with, the real wizardry came into play when it was time to stretch those potatoes. Mashed potatoes might seem simple, but Depression-era cooks had a way of turning them into pure velvet with not a single drop of cream. The magic ingredient? Evaporated milk. It was shelf-stable, lasted forever, and came out of the can ready to bring some real comfort to the dinner table. When fresh dairy was hard to come by, evaporated milk stepped in like a dependable neighbor. Heat it gently, stir it into the mash, and suddenly you had creamy, dreamy potatoes that tasted like something way more expensive. Some home cooks even used a touch of nutmeg or a sprinkle of black pepper to elevate the flavor, depending on who taught them the trick. It is one of those humble shortcuts that proves just how far a little know-how could take you. But what really separated the seasoned bakers from the rest was how they handled their pie dough on a hot day. Pie crusts might be a baking basic now, but in the old days they were a battlefield. Anyone who has ever rolled out a dough in the middle of summer without air conditioning knows the struggle. That is why adding a splash of vinegar and using ice water became the gold standard for anyone chasing that perfect flake. The vinegar helped prevent too much gluten from forming, which meant the dough stayed tender. Ice water kept the fats cold, which is critical for that buttery, flaky texture. It was passed down from grandmothers who did not need a recipe, they just knew the feel. You would see it scribbled on an index card, wedged in an old cookbook, or murmured across a table at a church bake sale. It is the kind of trick that made every bite taste like a little slice of heaven. But getting that pie out of the pan without disaster? That was a trick of its own. Before parchment paper took over kitchen drawers and bakery shelves, there was another hero in town: wax paper. Lining a cake pan with wax paper was the secret to the cleanest release you ever saw. Forget greasing and praying. Home bakers would trace the bottom of the pan onto the wax paper, cut it to size and lay it flat before pouring in the batter. Once that cake was done baking, it would pop right out smooth as silk. No ripped edges, no stuck corners, no heartbreak. It worked like a charm, especially in the years when every slice had to count and there was no room for do-overs. Even better, the wax paper could be reused a few times if you were careful. Not that anyone really had a choice. And it was not just about saving time. It was about preserving the little joys. Speaking of joys, wait until you hear what old Southern cooks used to do with flour before it even hit the pot. Most people think gravy is just flour, fat, and liquid. That is technically true, but back in the day, some folks knew how to make it sing. The trick? Toast the flour first. This was a Southern kitchen staple that added a deep, nutty flavor that regular roux just could not match. You would toss the flour into a dry skillet and stir it constantly until it turned golden brown, smelling almost like roasted nuts. Only then would it be added to your fat, usually bacon grease or lard, and finally whisked into broth or milk. The flavor that came out of that pot was nothing short of magic. Even simple dishes like biscuits and gravy suddenly had depth and richness that clung to your ribs. It made meals memorable, the kind of taste that made you close your eyes and nod like, "Yep, that's the one." But if you want to talk about rich, smoky flavor, You cannot leave out the kitchen gold people used to keep in a tin can right on the stove. That tin can sitting next to the stove? That was not trash, that was treasure. Bacon grease was liquid gold in mid-century kitchens, saved after every fry-up and repurposed into almost everything. You want crispy fried potatoes? Bacon grease. You want cornbread that makes you believe in second helpings? Bacon grease. You want cookies with a little smoky sweetness that somehow works? You guessed it. Folks would keep it in an old coffee can, strain out the bits, and let it harden until the next use. It was free, flavorful, and kept food interesting when ingredients were scarce. Some people even popped their popcorn in it for a salty, savory movie night snack that felt way fancier than it was. And the best part? You never threw it away. Not one drop. It was all about making the most of what you had. Speaking of preservation, there was another quiet little hero working behind the scenes, wax paper, and what it did for the all-American lunchbox. Plastic wrap may have taken over today, but in the golden age of the lunchbox, wax paper reigned supreme. Wrapping your sandwich in wax paper was not just a holdover from your grandmother's kitchen, it was how you kept your lunch crisp, cool, and perfectly fresh until the bell rang. Unlike plastic, wax paper let the sandwich breathe just enough so that bread did not go soggy and lettuce stayed snappy. Every working dad and school kid in the 1950s knew the rustle of wax paper meant something good was coming. Ham and cheese, bologna and mustard, or maybe even a cold meatloaf slice from the night before, each one carefully wrapped like a little gift. It might not seem like a big deal, but that extra touch made a difference. It meant someone cared. And as it turns out, preserving sandwiches was just the start of the creative genius from that era. The real magic came when dessert time rolled around and the freezer played a starring role. Ice cube trays were for more than just water back in the day. In kitchens where space was tight and appliances were limited, freezing cookie dough in those little compartments was a downright brilliant move. You could scoop up your dough, press it into the tray, and freeze perfect portions ready to pop out and bake at a moment's notice. Hosting a guest. Pull out a few cubes. Midnight craving? You are 10 minutes away from warm cookies without making a mess. This was meal prep before meal prep had a name. Parents loved it. Kids loved it even more. And the best part? It kept you from eating the whole batch in one sitting, which, let's be honest, was always a risk. These trays made dessert feel manageable, special, and just a bit sneaky. And if you thought that was clever, wait until you hear what people did to make their milk last a little longer, especially when refrigeration was still a luxury. In the 1930s, milk went sour fast. Not everyone had a working fridge, and even if they did, it did not always work reliably. So what did folks do? They boiled their milk. It sounds simple because it is, but it worked like a charm. By bringing milk just to a simmer and then letting it cool, people could extend its life by days. This made a world of difference when you were working with tight rations and a long walk to the store. Boiled milk did not just keep better, it also changed in taste slightly, becoming smoother and gentler on the stomach. Some even used it to make hot chocolate or custards because it gave a more mellow flavor. Sure, it required a bit more work, but that was the point. People back then were not just cooking, they were thinking, strategizing, preserving, and that same sharp thinking applied to baking too, where even butter needed a bit of a hack. Before food processors and pastry cutters were part of every wedding registry, folks had to get creative, especially when making biscuits. One of the best tricks from the Depression era? Grating cold butter straight into the biscuit mix. You would take a chilled stick, run it across a box grater like it was a block of cheese, and fold the little curls into your flour by hand. This kept the butter cold and distributed it evenly, which meant one thing: flaky, tender biscuits that puffed up like they were made in a country kitchen. No fancy tools, no shortcuts, just smart cooking from folks who knew what they were doing. This method gave you that golden edge and soft interior every time. It made baking feel like an art and an act of patience. But when it came to stretching meat into a meal that lasted all week, that required a whole different kind of creativity. and sometimes it meant crushing up a cracker or two. Back when meatloaf was less about comfort and more about survival, there was a trick that made it stretch just a little bit further, and it came from the cracker tin. Soda crackers, the plain kind you might have dunked in soup, were crushed up and used in place of breadcrumbs. Not just because they were cheaper, though they absolutely were, but because they gave meatloaf a lighter texture and helped bind everything together beautifully. People would save every last cracker from a party mix or lunch tray, crush them with a rolling pin, and mix them into ground meat with eggs, onions, and whatever seasonings were still on hand. It was an easy swap that did not cost a thing if you already had a box in the pantry. Even better, they soaked up juices like a sponge, making every slice feel more filling than it had any right to be. This kind of thrifty kitchen thinking was everywhere, and it extended right down to the pans, especially in the South, where there was a certain way you had to treat your cast iron before baking something special. If you ever wondered why your grandmother's cornbread had that perfect crisp edge, the kind that makes you reach for a second slice before you finish the first, it probably had to do with one thing: lard. More specifically, a cast iron skillet preheated with lard before the batter ever touched it. This was gospel in Southern kitchens long before anyone heard the words non-stick. The lard would sizzle as the batter hit the pan, instantly forming a golden, crunchy crust that gave way to a soft, steamy center. It was more than just flavor. It was texture, it was technique, it was tradition, and it made an ordinary dish into something unforgettable. Some cooks would even swirl the lard in the pan and let it heat up in the oven until it was practically smoking. That was the cue. Pour, bake, serve, and watch it disappear. These days, that trick is almost forgotten, but back then, it was the difference between a good dinner and a legendary one. And when it came to desserts, there was another hack that took cakes to new heights, literally. Angel food cake is one of those desserts that looks delicate but demands precision. And back in the day, bakers had a trick that kept it from collapsing into a sad little sponge after baking. They flipped it upside down on a glass soda bottle. No cooling rack, no fancy stand. Just the bottle your root beer came in, neck first into the center tube of the cake pan. This let gravity do the work. As the cake cooled, it stayed tall and airy, with that perfect sponge texture that practically floated off the plate. Angel food cake was light, sure, but it was also serious business in mid-century kitchens. You had to whip those egg whites just right, fold everything gently, and trust the bottle to do its job at the end. It was a rite of passage for home bakers. And if your kitchen smelled like warm vanilla and sugar after pulling it out of the oven, there was one more finishing touch, one that did not go on the cake but floated through the whole house. Candles were a luxury in the war years, and air fresheners were not a thing you picked up at the store. So when people wanted their homes to smell inviting, they turned to something already in the kitchen: apple peels. Simmering them gently in a pot of water, sometimes with a stick of cinnamon or a bit of clove, released a warm, sweet scent that filled the house. It smelled like comfort, like dessert, like someone was about to bring out a tray of something delicious, even if there was nothing baking at all. It was the kind of trick you learned from your neighbor or saw your mother doing without ever needing to ask why. It just made sense. People made do with what they had, and if that meant wringing a little joy out of leftover fruit scraps, so be it. It was easy, frugal, and somehow better than anything out of a spray can today. And just like with air fresheners, seasoning meat was another area where folks learned to get creative, with something as simple as tomato juice. When you could not afford a good cut of steak, you did the next best thing. You found a way to make a tough one taste like it belonged in a steakhouse. That is where tomato juice came in. It was not just for drinking or soup bases. Cooks discovered it could also break down muscle fibers in tougher meats, turning a chewy round steak into something tender and flavorful. The acidity in the tomato juice worked like a mild marinade, and when left to soak for a few hours, it made a noticeable difference. It also added a hint of brightness to the meat that was especially welcome during times when spices were hard to come by. Some families would stretch the effect even further by using stewed tomatoes or adding a splash of vinegar if they were running low on juice. It was clever, it was effective, and it gave budget meals a little bit of flair. But if there was one thing you absolutely had to get right in those days, it was bread. And keeping it soft while it rose required a bit of old-school kitchen magic. Before bread machines and steam-injected ovens, there was just a bowl, some dough, and a little patience. But smart home bakers in the early 20th century knew a secret to keep their loaves light, fluffy, and rising like a dream. Tuck a damp cloth over the dough while it rested. This trick acted like a homemade proofing drawer, holding in just enough moisture and warmth to keep the dough from drying out or developing a crust too early. Towels were dampened with warm water and draped loosely over mixing bowls, sometimes placed near the pilot light of a gas stove or wrapped inside a quilt for insulation. It was simple, free, and most of all, it worked. The dough stayed soft, expanded evenly, and baked up like something from a professional kitchen. It may have looked like just another lump of flour and yeast, but that little cloth was the difference between bread that fed you and bread that fed your soul. And once the loaf was in the oven, it was time to focus on the sides, especially if you wanted your vegetables to pop off the plate. Long before food photography took over our screens, 1940s housewives were already masters of presentation. One of their most underrated tricks? Shocking vegetables in ice water. After blanching greens like green beans, peas, or broccoli for a quick minute or two in boiling water, they would immediately plunge them into a bowl of icy cold water to stop the cooking process. The result? Vegetables that kept their snap, their nutrients, and, most impressively, their bright, natural color. No dull army green beans here. This trick preserved that just-picked freshness, whether it was for a dinner party or just something nice to serve the family. Even better, it helped prep veggies ahead of time for the icebox or freezer, if you were lucky enough to have either. And while the main dish got most of the glory, little touches like this made the whole meal feel more thoughtful. Of course, if you wanted your salads to stay crisp and refreshing, there was another old-school trick hiding in the crisper drawer. Celery might seem like the last thing to fuss over, but if you grew up watching your mom or grandmother wrap those stalks in foil, you knew it was not just about tradition. It was about keeping things fresh the right way. This was a classic refrigerator trick passed down from generation to generation, especially before produce drawers were a standard feature. Wrapping celery tightly in foil helped trap just enough moisture to keep it from wilting while still allowing gases to escape so it did not turn slimy. The difference was night and day. Foil-wrapped celery stayed snappy, crunchy, and ready for chicken salad or snack trays for over a week, while uncovered celery quickly turned limp and sad. It was the kind of small thing that quietly made a big difference in kitchens where waste was not an option. But tricks like this did not stop at vegetables. When pantry staples like eggs and oil were in short supply, home bakers came up with something unexpected, and it changed cake forever. Mayonnaise in cake might sound like a dare today, but during wartime and rationing, it was nothing short of brilliant. Eggs and oil were precious, sometimes impossible to get. But mayonnaise? That was shelf-stable and sitting right there in the pantry. Made of just oil, eggs, and vinegar, mayonnaise acted as a one-stop swap that added moisture, fat, and richness to cakes without needing to crack an egg or pour a single drop of oil. It was especially popular in chocolate cake recipes where the slight tang of the mayo disappeared into a deep, fudgy flavor that surprised just about everyone. Folks were skeptical until they tasted it. Then it became a go-to. This was not cutting corners, it was cutting costs with creativity. A depression-born solution that somehow made the cake better, not worse. And it did not stop at dessert. The same sense of resourceful flavor could be found hanging right over the pantry door, drying gently in paper bags. Fresh herbs are great, but when you are living off your victory garden and trying to stretch what little you have, drying herbs became a must. And not just laying them out on a towel, there was a system. People would gather bundles of basil, thyme, or parsley, tuck them into brown paper lunch bags, poke a few air holes, and hang them upside down in a dry corner of the kitchen or pantry. This trick kept dust off the herbs and let them dry slowly and evenly. No special equipment, no electricity, just time and airflow. Once dried, they were crumbled and jarred, ready to bring a splash of life to soups, stews, roasts, you name it. It turned the garden into a year-round source of flavor and helped families stay self-sufficient. Some folks still swear by it today, and it is easy to see why. But for all the creativity that went into stretching ingredients, sometimes it was about making the most of what was already used, like that last bit of coffee sitting cold in the pot. Before there were double-walled tumblers and trendy cafes selling cold brew by the gallon, there was the ice cube tray. And if you were one of the clever few, you knew exactly what to do with that last half cup of leftover coffee. Pour it into the tray, freeze it, and you had the perfect building blocks for iced coffee that never got watered down. It was efficient, frugal, and downright genius. Instead of throwing out cold coffee, which, let us be honest, happened a lot, you turned it into something even better. Drop a few cubes into a glass of milk or cooled coffee, and suddenly you had a chilled drink that actually got stronger as the ice melted. Some folks even added a bit of cinnamon or sugar to the cubes before freezing for a little flair. It was one of those quiet kitchen tricks that made every sip feel like a treat. And speaking of treats, nothing impressed dinner guests quite like topping a homemade dessert with whipped cream, especially when it was made without any cream at all. In the days when cream was either too expensive or too hard to find, folks got creative, and out came the magic of mock whipped cream. All it took was a can of evaporated milk, chilled overnight until it was ice cold. Then, using a hand beater or a bit of elbow grease, you whipped it up until it fluffed like a dream. Add a splash of vanilla, maybe a spoonful of sugar, and you had a topping that looked and tasted close enough to the real thing to fool just about anyone. It was light, sweet, and perfect for pies, puddings, or a bowl of fresh fruit. This was wartime ingenuity at its finest, making something from almost nothing and doing it with style. Families loved it because it was affordable. Kids loved it because it was dessert. And the best part? It gave people a taste of something fancy during a time when fancy was hard to come by. But it was not just desserts that needed saving. Fresh produce needed a little help too, and the solution was sitting right in the kitchen drawer. Lettuce might not seem like the kind of thing that needs a preservation strategy, but ask anyone who lived through the refrigerator boom and the metal icebox days before it, and they will tell you, soggy lettuce ruins everything. That is why storing lettuce with a paper towel became one of those passed-down secrets of the kitchen. You would wash and dry your greens, place a paper towel in the storage container or bag, and let it do the heavy lifting. The towel absorbed moisture, stopped the leaves from getting slimy, and kept everything crisp and ready for the next salad or sandwich. It worked like a charm. This trick was especially popular during the heyday of Tupperware parties in the 1950s and 1960s, when fridges were small and food waste was not an option. Housewives compared tips like this the same way folks trade recipes today. It was simple, brilliant, and saved more than a few salads from the trash. And if lettuce needed that kind of attention, eggs, especially the poached kind, required a whole other level of finesse. Poaching eggs sounds simple until you try it. Then you realize it is one of the most temperamental breakfast tasks out there. Unless, of course, you knew the vinegar trick. Just a spoonful of white vinegar in simmering water was enough to coax an egg into staying whole and neat instead of turning into a ghostly swirl of whites. This was a staple in Army mess halls, diners, and home kitchens alike from the 1940s all the way through the 1970s. Vinegar acted like a gentle guardrail, tightening the proteins and helping the egg form that beautiful teardrop shape. You did not need fancy silicone cups or swirling water techniques. Just heat, a splash of vinegar, and a careful hand. It was the kind of breakfast that felt elevated but was born out of simplicity and practicality. And when it came to preserving things a little longer, especially expensive ingredients like cheese, there was another hack that involved a completely different kind of coating. Cheese was not something you wasted. Not during the Great Depression, not during wartime rationing, and certainly not when refrigeration was a finicky luxury. So people found a simple way to keep cheese from growing mold, and it involved butter. After cutting into a block of cheese, you would coat the exposed surface with a thin layer of softened butter. This sealed out air and moisture, extending the shelf life by days or even weeks. It was a quiet act of preservation that worked surprisingly well. Some folks stored cheese in a crock, others wrapped it in wax paper or cloth soaked in vinegar. But butter? That was a trick that worked across the board. It kept cheddar from sweating, Gouda from going soft, and everything else from turning green before its time. It was a kind of care and attention we do not always see in our grab-and-go world today. And speaking of care, let us talk about rice, specifically how a humble tea towel turned a sticky mess into a fluffy miracle. If your rice ever turned out gummy, sticky, or just plain sad, you were probably missing a trick that home economics teachers used to swear by: layering a damp tea towel over the pot of cooked rice. Once the water had simmered away and the heat was off, a clean, damp towel was placed between the pot and the lid. This absorbed excess steam while still trapping the warmth, letting the rice continue to cook gently without clumping up. It was like giving your rice a warm, gentle hug, coaxing each grain to stand tall and separate. This was not fancy technique, it was everyday genius from folks who cooked with care, not gadgets. The result? Fluffy, separated grains that were as perfect as anything from a fancy rice cooker. It was a technique passed down quietly, the kind of thing you would learn in a high school kitchen class or from a grandmother who knew how to make the most of every meal. It worked for white rice, brown rice, even pilaf. It was especially handy when stovetops were all you had, because believe it or not, sometimes even the pie came off the burner instead of out of the oven. There were long, hot summers when turning on the oven felt like a punishment. That is when resourceful cooks pulled out the cast iron skillet and made magic happen right on the stove. Baking a pie on the stovetop might sound odd today, but it was a common trick when electricity was rationed or kitchens did not have reliable ovens. The cast iron held heat like nothing else, and with a lid on top, or sometimes just a second skillet flipped over, you had yourself a makeshift oven. Fruit pies worked best, especially when using thick fillings like apples or berries that could be simmered down and spooned into a crust browned to golden perfection on the stovetop. It was pie without the sweat. And it still tasted like something pulled fresh from a bakery window. You might miss the scent that fills the house when a pie's in the oven, but not the results. And when it came time to juice up a drink or brighten a dish, there was one more old-school move worth remembering, courtesy of soda jerks everywhere. Back when soda fountains were the heartbeat of every small-town drugstore, there was a little behind-the-counter trick that never failed. Roll your citrus before juicing. Lemons, limes, oranges, whatever you were using, a quick roll across the counter with the palm of your hand helped break down the internal membranes, loosening up the juice and making every squeeze more productive. It was subtle, fast, and made a noticeable difference. Every drop counted, especially when fresh citrus was not cheap, and every splash was meant to flavor drinks, sauces, or Sunday baking. Some soda jerks even gave the fruit a quick 10-second warm-up under hot water first, just to get that extra yield. This tiny ritual found its way from fountain counters to home kitchens, where folks learned that rolling fruit was just as useful for lemonade as it was for lemon meringue. But the little wins did not stop there, because when cookies came out of the oven, they did not hit a fancy rack. They went straight onto brown paper. That crackly, buttery bottom you remember from your childhood cookies? It did not come from some high-end baking sheet or gold-plated cooling rack. It came from brown paper bags, cut open and laid flat on the counter. Once the cookies were done, they were slid onto the paper where the excess butter would soak in just enough to give that crisp outer edge while keeping the center soft. It was a trick that felt casual, lazy even, but it delivered results. People reused grocery bags for this, bakery wrap, even paper sacks from the corner store. It was baking that met you where you were, with what you had. And in homes where you baked in bulk, because everyone was coming over or because once the oven was hot, you made it count. It helped cool big batches in a flash. It was nostalgic, unfussy, and it just worked. But if you want to talk about keeping baked goods at their best days later, there is one more humble trick that people used, and it is still as clever now as it was then. You would be surprised what a single slice of bread or an apple wedge can do inside a cake tin. Back before airtight containers and preservatives, this was the go-to method to keep cakes soft and moist days after baking. You would place the cake in its tin or on a plate, cover it with foil or a dome, and tuck in a slice of sandwich bread or a few apple pieces beside it. The bread, or apple, acted like a moisture magnet. Instead of drying out, the cake absorbed just enough humidity to stay tender and fresh, while the bread would harden and dry up instead. It was especially common with birthday cakes, snack cakes, and anything made in large batches. This small, quiet act of preservation could mean the difference between dry disappointment and another perfect slice with your morning coffee. It was low-tech, low-cost, and high on impact. Just like the 30 forgotten cooking tricks we dusted off from the past. These were not just hacks. They were the legacy of resourceful hands, hard times, and hearts full of flavor. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. Wooden spoon collections were also a very typical sight in America during the 20th century. A lot of these things got as popular as they did because they lasted so long and were also pretty durable. Nowadays, it is very easy to get a replacement for something if it breaks or something goes wrong, but it was more of an inconvenience then. Wooden spoons didn't melt or warp even with daily exposure to heat, so they were used in nearly every aspect of cooking. Besides the practicalities of all of it, the aesthetic appeal was also really out there. They went along with most of the interior of homes back then, which was pretty wood-oriented, and the rustic charm and warm, dulcet tones of a well-stacked collection of wooden spoons really brought it all together. It's when the little things come together that a place really shines, you know? Salt is really good at quickly cleaning your iron pans. This happens for a few reasons, but two of them are that salt just happens to be inherently very abrasive, and it's also very good at degreasing. This helps food that's stuck on the pan and any grease that also won't go away to come off easily. You don't want to be damaging the surface of your pan after all. Why is salt like that, though? Salt happens to be really coarse, and that makes it really good for situations where you would need an abrasive. Sprinkle just a little bit on a hot pan with a bit of leftover oil and start scrubbing with a cloth. You'll see the difference almost immediately, and that's all thanks to the coarseness of salt. Why does salt work as a degreaser? Well, that's because when you use it alongside heat, salt changes its properties a little, as most things do when they come into contact with heat. Now, salt can help to absorb and break down greasy surfaces because it helps draw that grease away. Salt has a lot of good absorption properties too. It's really good at taking away moisture from other liquids and oils. It's also good for preventing some rust, but that's a little side tip I'm including for free. Sweetening with birch bark was one of the most ingenious and almost completely forgotten cooking secrets passed down through native traditions. Long before refined sugar ever touched American soil, Native American cooks knew that certain birch trees contained a natural, subtle sweetness hidden within their sap and inner bark. By carefully harvesting thin strips and boiling them down, they created a lightly sweet syrup or infusion that could flavor drinks, breads, and even savory dishes without overwhelming them. It was a sweetness that whispered rather than shouted, blending seamlessly with the smoky, rich flavors of open-fire cooking. Even today, a few remote communities and experimental chefs are bringing birch syrup back to the table, rediscovering a depth of flavor that supermarket sugar can never hope to match. But when it came to cooking full meals without pots or pans, there was one natural vessel that changed everything: giant pumpkins, hollowed out and transformed into Earth's own slow cookers. Now, you've probably heard your grandmother emphasize the importance of always keeping your pasta dry. But have you ever thought about why that is? The thing with drying pasta is that besides just avoiding basic issues like how it clumps together, becomes the worst thing ever to eat, and just loses its freshness, you really just want to preserve pasta because of one simple concept: moisture content. Like we've discussed before, moisture is something that bacteria and mold need desperately to grow. If they don't get it, they're liable to have a breakdown, figuratively and literally. This is why drying pasta has been such a tradition in Italian culture and just about everywhere that popularly consumes it. Drying your pasta reduces the water content by a good 15%, and that helps the pasta achieve a much higher shelf life. I'm talking months, and if you really know how to preserve, then even years. Don't believe me? Trust me, there's an Italian on YouTube with an essay on it. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. String is actually really good, not just for slicing your cake and your desserts, but for stringing up and trussing your poultry too. It helps keep the bird in a compact and even shape, which, as you may have obviously guessed, helps ensure that the bird cooks evenly too. Trussing your poultry with string helps to make sure that the bird is cooking evenly because of the fact that it helps maintain the overall shape of the bird. The legs and wings stay close to the body instead of away, and this helps the heat travel overall a lot more easily throughout the bird. You get uniform cooking this way, which is always better as opposed to, well, ununiform cooking. The poultry really keeps its moisture too, which is always good because, let's be honest, nobody likes eating a dry bird. The tight packaging helps to make sure the moisture doesn't get away, and the meat overall stays a lot more tender and juicy. Trussing also has an unexpected benefit, but since the body stays tighter and more together, the presentation ends up looking better too. This is a part of why trussing your bird around Thanksgiving became such a massively practiced hobby across the United States. After all, when the occasion is special, you don't just want to make a good bird, you want to make it look pretty sitting there with all the toppings too. Then there's the stuffing, which always tends to kill everyone's vibe when it overflows. The aesthetic appeal of the bird, combined with how it just overall cooks a lot better and stays more crispy too thanks to the even baking, means that there's almost never a reason not to truss your bird. Ash baking was one of the most brilliant and humbling ways Native American cooks created bread without any tools, fancy ovens, or even a proper surface. When you needed to eat, you did not wait for the perfect setup. You dug into the earth itself. Dough was shaped into rough rounds and placed directly onto a bed of hot ashes and embers, then gently covered with more hot ash. The bread would cook slowly, surrounded by a blanket of heat, becoming crusty on the outside and pillowy soft on the inside. If a little ash clung to it, so be it. You brushed it off and bit into a smoky, earthy flavor that modern kitchens would pay fortunes to recreate. It was cooking stripped down to its raw, purest form, food born right from fire and earth. Today, ash-baked bread might seem primitive, but taste one bite of it, and you will understand exactly why this method lasted for centuries. And if you thought bread from ash was wild, wait until you hear how native chefs used cactus to transform even the toughest, most stubborn pieces of meat into buttery, tender feasts. So clothespins really help when it comes to sealing bags, and that's thanks to their effective design. This is because the clothespins help to close the bag without any kind of secondary tool. You don't need pins and a staple, or needles and a thread, or anything really. All you need is a clothespin, which comes built in with a spring-loaded clamping mechanism. Why is this important? Well, it lets the clothespin hold on to items like a bag extremely hard. You kind of want to do that with something as important as your bag. The closure helps to keep any unwanted air outside too, and that means that anything in your bag stays fresh and doesn't get spoiled. It could be your lunch, it could be a salad, or it could be a product that's not supposed to touch air. Plus, clothespins are really reusable, so there's no reason not to be using these. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Something that was really common as a bit of decoration in households back then was a teapot. In a sense, it has lost the same love it had in its golden days where people only used teapots for storing their freshly brewed tea, since microwaves are so incredibly common now. They were common in rural areas as well, which is likely where teapots became part of the cottagecore aesthetic. They were also used to brew tea, as you could steep tea leaves in them and let the hot water really soak in all of the flavors and aroma. Teapots came in different shapes and sizes, and you could always experiment and see which one worked the best for you. So, this one might take you for a spin, and I'm not sure if most of you would even be familiar with the concept. Potting your butter is a pretty historical technique, but not one that's especially popular in United States history or culture. The idea this time around is to take something like a jar or a crock and store your butter in that, and then cover it with a generous layer of clarified fat. This can either be lard or the clarified fat that comes from the butter itself, but the reason for doing this is that the layer acts as a seal. It helps to keep the butter fresh, and that's because the water and milk solids from butter are removed. What you get is pure, unadulterated butterfat left. Since it is pure, it's less likely to spoil in comparison to whole butter. Protecting it from the air also does the usual routine of keeping it safe from airborne germs and microbes. People used to do this a lot because in rural areas, even when refrigeration was a thing, it hadn't become a widespread or accessible practice. In cold places, for example, the mountain ranges here, storing these pots in dark basements would help push the shelf life up even more. Chilled bowls are actually fantastic for placing your whipping cream in because the cold temperatures here really help in keeping the fat in the cream stable. Why is the stability of the fat of your whipping cream a subject you may want to be invested in? Well, that's because unlike keeping a stable diet or sleep schedule, the effects this time around are a lot more immediate. Whipping cream is made up of a lot of fat molecules that get suspended in the water. That's what happens when you whip the cream. Those molecules start clumping together and make what you see. At room temperature even, this fat can start to melt, and it means you lose the texture of whipping cream when it's at its best. If you chill the bowl though, you don't get this problem because the fat actually stays firm and helps the foam keep its shape. Pretty interesting, right? I know I like my whipping cream at tip-top performance. And if you do too, maybe you want to keep this one in mind. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Why should you ever use boiled water to clear ice or to get rid of any existing ice? Well, besides the obvious logical leap of hot beating cold, the Mpemba effect is a thing too. While I don't think this is a commonly known phenomenon, it is one we could stand to learn just a bit more about. The Mpemba effect is basically scientists gathering together to observe that hot water freezes decently faster than cold water does. Why would this happen? Well, there's actually a lot of debate on that little topic alone. There are lots of theories that suggest that if you start with hot water, you get some benefits that you otherwise would never get with cold water. For example, hot water evaporates a lot faster than cold water, and that means less overall water has to freeze. Then, you also get convection currents that help cool the water since the cold travels a lot easier. Plus, hot water doesn't supercool, and supercooling is essentially just a state where water's temperature goes below the freezing point, but it doesn't turn to ice. Since hot water doesn't run into this issue, it actually might be possible that this helps it freeze a bit better than its colder alternative. Overall, when it comes to clearing ice out, frozen water traps all kinds of gases. Remember those conspiracy theories about ancient world-ending plagues being released as a result of the polar caps melting in the South and North Poles? Yeah, ice holds a lot more than just ancient sick insects. It can trap pretty much anything, from minerals to air bubbles, and hot water really helps clear this out because it dissolves those gases and kills those impurities. Maybe it's less clearing the ice and more obliterating whatever's inside it. But either way, what you need gone gets gone pretty fast. Jello molds were a typical 20th century snack that let people get creative and fashionable with their desserts. You could use them for gelatin-based dishes or jelly bowls and cakes, and they were very common at parties and family gatherings. Of course, the kids in particular enjoyed Jello molds the most out of everyone else, even if they had no idea how to use them to shape the Jello properly. That is probably why every grandma always had some of these though, so that when their grandkids eventually did come over, they could enjoy playing around with their food a little before. After all, they would probably get scolded for doing so at home. To be honest, most Jello mold brands got really popular in the 1960s in particular as they became a convenient trend since Jello was also getting more and more popular. The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Honey preservation is basically one of the few bounties of nature that will almost never betray you. It's good for your skin. It helps to boost your gut health. It doesn't ever go bad. And now I'm going to tell you all about how it preserves itself better than anything else. So, the thing with honey is that the super low moisture content in honey basically makes it impossible for any of the icky and nasty stuff we've gone over so far to grow or even get a chance to come into existence. Honey's also really acidic, and it falls anywhere between 3.2 and 4.5 on the pH scale. This helps to curb stomp the growth of any gross bacteria and fungi, so it's got a natural preservative quality in that. Anything that's got a strong acidic background naturally will do that. But honey works better for a few other reasons, like how honey naturally exudes something called glucose oxidase. When you combine this with just glucose, or sugar, you get hydrogen peroxide. This is a natural microbe hunter, and it basically destroys bacteria on site. Honey has a high sugar content already and is largely made up entirely of glucose and fructose, so go figure. Long story short, the thing is just built different and built strong. Using pumpkin shells as nature's crockpots was one of the most visually stunning and practical techniques Native American cooks ever invented. Imagine carving out a big, sturdy pumpkin, filling it with a mixture of meats, roots, grains, and herbs, and setting it carefully near a low, steady fire. The thick pumpkin walls would slowly roast from the outside while the food inside simmered gently, absorbing all the sweet, nutty flavors of the squash itself. The pumpkin became pot, oven, and seasoning all in one, with no waste and no need for heavy metal tools. When the meal was ready, you simply cut into the tender pumpkin itself and ate it alongside the hearty stew it had helped create. It was a way of turning even the simplest gathering into a feast. And if you thought cooking in pumpkins was impressive, just wait until you see how native cooks used nothing but green leaves and open steam to create fish dishes that tasted like a gift straight from the earth itself. Floral china had a bit of a renaissance in the 20th century, and those crockpots always looked good with it. This was because Victorian design trends started having a big focus on ornate and floral prints, and china manufacturers listened as soon as the trend popped up. They wanted to put out more and more floral designs to attract more of an audience, and they especially wanted to get ahead early in the rat race involving dinnerware sets. These sets started becoming very widespread, and most would come with floral designs, and it was like a whole new market with untapped sales for a lot of producers. As a result, you had every house loaded with matching fine china sets that always looked like a painting, or had every kind of flower you had seen in your life on a different plate. Lye curing your fish has been the alkaline all-rounder for all your fish preservation-related needs for centuries. This traditional preservation method takes full advantage of lye and shows you just how much of an MVP it really is. This process actually goes back to the very early times of Asian cultures, and the reason behind how this works is pretty interesting. Lye as an alkaline solution raises the pH level of a fish by like 2 folds, and this would typically look like the fish being treated in a diluted solution of lye that's been mixed with water and salt. Basically, fish has a lot of protein in it, which, is no surprise, right? What you might not know is that the alkalinity of lye disrupts that protein and makes it a lot more resistant to spoilage. It changes the whole structure, so now you don't just have protein, you have protein pro. Get it? I'll see myself out. Anyway, it doesn't just do those enhancements, it also boosts your catch of the day's resistance to those filthy microbes that keep popping up every 2 minutes. Pretty neat, right? Pre-freezing pies really helps before you delve deep into that baking rabbit hole, and it's for 2 reasons. You get a much flakier crust, which I'm assuming is something you want, and the fillings also stay really even, which I know you want. So, there are some sciencey reasons behind why this happens, and we'll definitely be getting into them. But if you're here for the too long, didn't read the version, then basically, moisture control, temperature regulation, and it helps keep the fat. Now, for the actual explanation. So, pie dough has a lot of cold fat, and that's what helps make that really flaky texture in the first place. Pre-freezing helps to solidify that fact and make sure the fat remains as solid as it can be, and the fat hopefully maintains its structure too. Plus, when you usually bake a pie without freezing it, the soft, soggy, and moist filling can keep the bottom crust really soggy. And this is a problem because you always want a firm base for your pie. The cold temperature of a pie that's been pre-frozen is an entirely different ballgame, though. This helps slow the process down in the oven, and overall, the fat at the bottom of the dough solidifies before the filling has a chance to soften it up. The filling itself is also getting more set and firm, and that's because being frozen helps keep it in a solid state, which helps make sure that it cooks more evenly. So, just a small trip in the freezer can give your pie the pick-me-up it needed, huh? Cactus as a natural tenderizer sounds almost too strange to believe, but it was an everyday trick in many native kitchens. Certain varieties, like prickly pear, are packed with natural enzymes that break down tough muscle fibers in meat. By rubbing raw cactus slices over a piece of game meat, or even marinating it in cactus juice, they could turn chewy, sinewy cuts into tender, flavorful meals that needed almost no extra cooking. It was pure kitchen magic, pulled straight from the harshest landscapes. In places where hunting was hard and every scrap of meat mattered, this trick was not just clever, it was survival. No waste, no frustration, just another example of how nature handed over its secrets to those who knew how to listen. The best part is that cactus does not mask the flavor of the meat. It simply softens it, letting the real richness shine through. Even today, modern chefs have started waking up to this forgotten genius. But it was not just fresh meals that mattered. When you needed to carry food across miles of wilderness, you needed another skill altogether: the incredible art of sun-drying meats under the open sky. Grandmas thought that rolling pins were pretty essential to a good baking session. You could not go a day without seeing one be put to use, as it was just a very multi-purpose tool that helped in every way possible. You could flatten dough with them, roll out a pie crust or a tart crust, as well as the doughs for cookies. You could get cookie dough to a very precise thickness with a rolling pin, and many a wonderful batch of gingerbread, shortbread, and red velvet cookies, which were really popular back then, were rolled out thanks to these pins. In the hands of an amateur, they may not be the best tool, but in the hands of a veteran home chef that has been rolling and baking for most of their life, there was arguably no tool better than these pins. If you even needed to make croissants, puff pastry, or donuts, you could use rolling pins. And if you wanted to save a little on birthday costs by baking a cake at home, that was pretty easy thanks to a grandma who knew how to work a pin. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Butter curlers were another little trinket that saw a lot of use in most households, thanks to the simple benefits of life it would let you enjoy, like very pretty-looking butter. Some home chefs were much more focused on presentation, decoration, and maintaining the ambiance with the look of their food than others. They always had butter curlers handy because at formal meals or dinner parties, this elevated the entire mood because of how good it could make your food look. Homes that had hosting and entertaining as a priority always had curlers around, and nowadays some still use them because of the flexibility it gives you. With butter curlers, you could get more controlled and moderate curls of butter out instead of large spreads that really burned through your stock and had you running to the grocer's again and again. Acorn meal might not sound glamorous today, but to Native American cooks, it was a golden ticket to rich, sustaining nutrition. In a world where wheat and cornmeal were not always reliable, acorns from oak trees were gathered in huge numbers, then carefully leached to remove bitterness. The result was a fine, nutty flour that could be used to make breads, thick soups, or even hearty porridges. Acorn meal carried a deep, earthy taste that felt heavier and more nourishing than modern flour, and it was packed with oils and minerals that kept bodies strong through brutal winters and hard seasons. It was slow, careful work, but it paid off with food that could last for months. And unlike store-bought flour today, acorn meal reminded every bite of where it came from. But even when bread was needed quickly, native chefs had a trick up their sleeves, heating river stones until they became the perfect natural griddles for making flatbreads on the fly. If one of these brought back a memory or gave you a new kitchen idea, drop it in the comments like you are passing down a family secret, and do not forget to like the video and subscribe for more.